Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The murder of two young Israeli diplomats at the Jewish Museum in the American capital has confirmed that anti-Israeli demonstrations in Western countries can escalate to a new level of confrontation, a level of terrorist warfare. Well, as we know, every major war has its own tragic consequences. When the civil war in Syria began, observers warned Western leaders if they did not establish a no-fly zone over Syria and stop Bashar al-Assad's repression of his own people, it would lead to a serious migration crisis in the West. And that migration crisis would increase the popularity of radical, far-right, and possibly far-left political forces. That is exactly what happened. There was probably nothing unexpected about the consequences the Syrian civil war had for Europe and the United States. Now, Russia's war against Ukraine, although it has not triggered migration consequences comparable to those of the Syrian war, has already led to a different processor fear of war in Central and Western European countries, a further strengthening of the positions of far-right and far-left political forces, and the creation of conditions for the dismantling of European democracy in the coming years. And again, this is not political fiction, but a reality that Europe is facing. And this reality, as the most tangible outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian war, was already being discussed back in 2022, when the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, made the decision to reformat the conflict and to begin a war of attrition against the neighboring state. Western leaders, however, decided to take part in this war of attrition, hoping that Russia would eventually abandon its goals. Soon, these Western leaders will most likely no longer be in power in the country. They will be replaced by completely different people from entirely different political parties. The war in the Middle East, October 7, 2023, even then, it was clear that the lack of a clear understanding of how this war would end, the absence of a focus on the need to put pressure on the terrorist organization Hamas, not only by Western countries, but also by countries of the global South, which continue to keep their borders closed to residents of the Gaza Strip. All of this would naturally lead to a shift in sentiment in Western countries, to an increase in anti-Semitic actions, and in turn to the possibility of the spread of terror, which incidentally is not the first time it has become a scourge for Western societies. After the murder of Western diplomats, questions have always arisen about how to ensure the security of various embassies. The United States acted decisively, going so far as to eliminate entire terrorist groups. The death of Israeli diplomats will likely result only in loud statements, which we have already heard from US. President Donald Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and other American politicians, as well as members of the European political elite. At the same time, no one will talk about the fact that not only Israel, but the West as a whole has lost the information war that should in any case have brought to the forefront the fate of the Israelis killed in the Hamas raid and the hostages who are still being held by the terrorist organization. From the perspective of participants in anti-Israeli demonstrations in the United States and European countries, these actions by the Hamas leadership and their supporters within the Palestinian Authority seem entirely legitimate. And naturally, such an attitude inevitably breeds terrorism. Moreover, we can once again return to the civil war in Syria, which the West decided not to stop in order to avoid falling out with Vladimir Putin. We remember how the American and Russian presidents negotiated about Syria literally on the steps during one of their high-level meetings. Another important contribution of the President of the United States, Barack Obama, to our shared future. And now this disregard for the Syrian civil war has also created a kind of base for anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic demonstrations in Europe. You could say a demographic base with which the West can now do little. So, to my great regret, the death of Israeli diplomats in Washington may not be the last such killing, but only the beginning of a whole series of terrorist acts well prepared or carried out by certain so-called lone wolves targeted, both at diplomats of the State of Israel and at representatives of Jewish communities in the United States and European countries. And the longer the crisis in Gaza remains unresolved, and in fact there are no objective conditions for its resolution, the more serious the problems with terrorist activity will become in the West and the Middle East. And we must begin preparing for this grim and relentless reality today. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social networks and on my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello channels, which help support the development of these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Follow me on my social networks. Peace to you all.